On Saturday night, a fortnight ago, someone asked me, "How's your dad, Michael?" I had barely begun to reply when I got the call from Rachel to say that Dad was, in fact, dead. The question, "How's your dad, Michael?" sounds straightforward enough. And yet, I have to admit, it's one of the hardest questions I have ever had to answer. For as long as I can remember, my heart would sink and my stomach would churn every time someone asked. That's because trying to be honest about that question while also observing social norms was rarely possible. So out of the ordinary was my father that there was never a simple summary that could make his experience understandable to the casual observer. Equally, when being honest, there were no easy ways to sanitise his experience to make it palatable. I could either grossly oversimplify or I could overwhelm my listener with much more explanation than they had ever bargained for. There was no satisfactory middle ground. A lot of other people's dads seemed to play games and sports with their kids, but not my dad. My dad would recount how he was never any good at football at school because he couldn't understand why anyone wanted the ball. "If they want the ball that much," he said, "I'd rather just give it to them. It means nothing to me." We did have fun going bowling together when I was little, but bowling, of course, is a game played by one person at a time, taking turns. It's easy to see in examples like this and many others that you will encounter today that my dad would clearly be diagnosed as autistic if he were a child today. But that was not the culture of his time, and it was not the way that he understood his experience. Autism, of course, is all the rage today. Some of you might hear me mention autism and think, "Aha, that makes total sense. All of a sudden I have a familiar box that I can put Melvyn in." But Dad is right now in the only box he's ever going to lie in comfortably. If there was one thing Dad hated more than anything else, it was diagnosis. If you asked me, "How's your dad, Michael?" an honest answer on many days could have been, "Oh, thanks for asking. Dad's fucking furious about materialism today." Dad chafed against every medical diagnosis he was ever given because he sensed that diagnostic labels and many others tended to obscure the complex spiritual, emotional and energetic dimensions of life in favour of superficial and reductive stories that denatured reality, removed its magic and rendered human relationships shallow. Plus, he argued they were epistemologically flawed anyway. Now, I'm only just getting started in describing Dad, but you can already see how quickly he would break through the guardrails of ordinary conversation and push uncomfortably against the boundaries of the boxes people put him in. And look, we've arrived at one of the foundations of his creative philosophy. Dino, could you hit the gong, please? I'm actually going to need you to be my gong bearer. Thank you. There are no boxes, no natural delineations between painting, poetry, music, dance, or any other art. All art is evidence of interiority, of experience, and of the dialogue between the artist and a greater reality. We should not try to understand art or people through categorization, but should rather seek intimacy with art through direct engagement of our senses. Gone. Now, I said that Dad was sometimes fucking furious about materialism. Indeed, Dad did not hold his opinions lightly, but in fairness, he would not have said like I did that he was fucking furious. Because on other days, he would have despaired about the unskillful uses of language. "How's your dad, Michael?" "Oh, thanks for asking. Today he's despairing about the de-evolution of the English language." Now, you and I could have a conversation about skillful uses of English and it might even be interesting, But it wasn't merely interesting to Dad. It wasn't just an intellectual curiosity. When I say he despaired at the denaturing of language, I mean he was really in despair. Michael, I don't think these people realise how much they attenuate their meaning when they overuse those swear words. He was right, of course, as he often was. Gone. Language, like all forms of art, is a potent means by which consciousness expresses itself. We don't merely spell words, we cast spells with words. The blade of language is dulled by habituation, imprecision, and laziness. Now, when I saw Dad lying dead in his bed the other day, I had a response that surprised me, and it might surprise you. I looked at him and I thought, oh, that's my dad. Not much has changed. And straight away I wondered, how could I think such a thing? The best way I can understand Dad was as someone who lived on the very edge of material reality at the best of times. He was a kind of liminal, interdimensional being. How's your dad, Michael? Oh, thanks for asking. Today he's standing on the threshold of the spirit world and he's finding that really overwhelming. So he woke up last night wailing in anguish. Now, when I saw Dad's body, I was struck by the sense that it had only taken the slightest nudge to send him all the way over to the other side, almost as if he had only partly been here all along. When I was little, Dad didn't play with me in the normal way, but that didn't mean that he was not interested in parenting in his own unique way. One of my earliest memories of Dad being my dad was when he taught me to sense my mum's energetic field. Mum lay down and Dad showed me how we could hold our hands over her and feel the subtle differences in energy around her body. And I had a revealing conversation with Dad several years ago when I asked him if he had ever tried psychedelics. He was someone who never, to my knowledge, had experimented with drugs. He barely drank and he had smoked a couple of cigarettes at most. When I asked him about psychedelics, he said no, as expected. But it was what came next that was what was revealing. He said, "It sounds interesting, but the trouble is that the descriptions I read about psychedelic experiences sound too much like my everyday experience. And it's already hard enough for me to live in the world as it is." Now, I know we're all unique, but my dad's everyday way of describing the world was dramatically different from what most people experience in ordinary states of consciousness. I remember him describing how one day he accidentally trapped his consciousness inside a bottle. He was really scared being stuck in there, but he did some patient troubleshooting and eventually figured out how to get himself out. How's your dad, Michael? Oh, thanks for asking. Do you mean before or after he got out of the bottle? I remember how Dad thought he could change the shape of clouds with his mind. I remember how he came back from a meeting with a colleague at work when he was an academic at La Trobe University, and how he described seeing a bright light emanating from her forehead. Dad was a talented conductor of orchestras. My mum would remark admiringly on the incredible physical grace that he embodied on the concert platform, even as an old man. She was struck by what she described as a profound embodiment of the music. Dad would have agreed about merging himself with the music, but he would also sometimes add other terms. He saw conducting as a purposeful channeling of ectoplasm through the conductor's baton. How's your dad, Michael? Thanks for asking. He enjoyed channeling ectoplasm today. In philosophy, there's a term taken from the German language, Umwelt, that is used to refer not to the world as an objective reality, but to the world as it is subjectively experienced by an embodied consciousness. My dad lived sincerely and intelligently in an Umwelt that most people would consider a world of magical fantasy at best and a delusion at worst. He was regarded by his first set of parents-in-law as coming dangerously close to satanic forces, and you can imagine how well that went for his marriage. But it wasn't just there. In religious and secular spaces alike, Dad's unique Umwelt marked him out as someone who was threatening or at least deeply uncomfortable for the stability of other people's worldviews. His way of making sense of the world stretched everyone's language, even his own, to breaking point. Ordinary language and the language of reason cannot come close to expressing truth. Poetry and other acts of extraordinary language speak more truthfully about the nature of reality than analytical prose. Language is at its most powerful, not when it is definitive, but when it is metaphorical. With all the energetic noise going on in his Umwelt, it was hard for Dad to attend to material concerns. Brushing his teeth, cutting his toenails and washing the dishes rarely made it up the list of priorities. But that didn't mean he wasn't trying. I remember one night in Goulburn, it was well after midnight, and we had all worked a long and exhausting day at the cafe. Kate, Dad and I were in the car on the way home when Kate realised that she had forgotten to put Glad wrap over the cakes. Desperate for a sleep, she decided to press on home instead of going back. I remember Dad dropping her off to sleep and turning back to put Glad wrap over all the cakes himself. In his words and actions, he told me that he so appreciated her work that he couldn't bear the idea that her cakes would dry out overnight. He wanted to honour and appreciate her with a simple act of service. When I wrote a song for my baby daughter a few days before a party, he quickly wrote a piano accompaniment and arranged a pianist so that I could sing the song at my party. As a teenager, he took me to the cinema and bought me movie posters for my bedroom wall. When I ran out of money building my house and didn't have an occupancy certificate, he lent me money to get it across the line. He came with me to men's retreats, and he regularly came to experience my Feldenkrais classes when I taught them. We would talk at length about somatic experience and the way that movement influences our Umwelts. There were so many wonderful things about Dad, but you don't understand how heroically difficult they were, and you don't understand the deep art of his life unless you really take in how hard it is to be very, very different. Dad had to live in a world that was destined always to misunderstand him, and he had to find non-linear ways to express his unique insights. He had to find ways to honour the reality of his Umwelt, and from that place he had to find whatever ways he could to communicate with, be understood by, and to be of service to others. They say when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. So when Dad despaired about language, he wrote poetry. When he despaired about the fast pace and social isolation of people on the street, he took music onto the street. When he despaired about truth, he responded with relentless curiosity. Dad's art was Dad's lemonade. Through writing, music, through busking, through painting, through energetic healing practices, poetry and through teaching, he worked creatively and with integrity to bridge the divide between his unusual Umwelt and those of others. There was never a simple answer to the question, "How's your dad?" But today I celebrate Dad's resilience and creativity in the face of overwhelming difficulty. Here is a taste of a short song that Dad wrote for me as a baby, a taste of his lemonade. I recorded it yesterday. How's my little boy today? How is he, I say? How's my little boy today? How is he, I say? In your eyes I see the skies of a heaven ablaze with the praise of God. How's my little boy today? How is he, I say?